Hi everybody, this is Joy at Pine Quilt Shop. Today we are going to talk about working with large scale fabrics. And I have a few fabrics laid out in front of me, and our focus today is talking about cutting up large scale fabrics and which types of large scale fabrics can you cut up successfully and which ones can you not cut up successfully. So the fabrics I have in front of me, I think everybody would agree they are all large scale prints. This is a Cafe facet print that is a Millefiori, and look at that big section that you have here. Definitely meets the large scale print qualifications. Same thing with this print. This is another Cafe print, and it is one of his cabbage prints. And again, look at the size of that cabbage flower. Large scale prints. Same thing here. This is actually a Laura Heine print, and it is also a large scale print. So large scale prints are wonderful for backings, they're wonderful for borders, and they're fun to put into areas where we have bigger blocks in a quilt. Maybe a setting triangle or a setting square. They're fun for those areas. But sometimes we look at a large scale print and we want to cut it up. And you can do that successfully with certain large scale prints, and you can't with others. So the key to being able to cut a large scale print up successfully is having fairly consistent color throughout, or having, like this one, quite a bit of the background fabric showing, even though there's larger motifs on top of it. You can see with these motifs that even though there's a motif there, you're still seeing some of that purple background fabric through it, versus here where you have a flower and there really isn't background showing. So that's one thing to think about, is do I have a consistent color throughout the prints? Do I have a part of the background consistently showing? Because that will help you be able to cut that large scale print up successfully into smaller pieces. So this print is one that it would be very tricky to cut up. It's one that would not cut up well because you don't have that color consistency. You have areas where you could cut a triangle and just get a yellow one. There's areas where you could cut it and just get a purple one, or maybe just get this peach and red, because there are large areas of unique colors. So this one would be very challenging to cut up into smaller pieces. The other three that I have would actually cut up fairly well because of consistent background showing, fairly consistent color palette. On this one we have some purple, some red, some green, but they're mixed throughout well enough that you can probably cut it up fairly well. And here we have huge prints, but we have a lot of orange. So it gives us that color consistency that allows us to cut it up. So one thing that we do here in the shop when we're looking at fabrics and trying to determine if the scale of a fabric will work, or is it something that we can cut up successfully, will it work in the area, is I will print pieces like this out. These are ones we actually used for a project a few years ago, and I use these to see what the fabric will look up, to simulate what it's going to look like when you cut it up and put it in a quilt block. I can print these out of Electric Quilt. It's a software program that I use. But if you are going to, say, try to cut one of these up into a 2-inch square or a 3-inch square, you can go ahead and easily draw that out on a piece of paper, cut it out. Make sure you're cutting the finished size, not the cut size, the finished size. Like here you can actually see where I had, when I printed this out of Electric Quilt, it showed me my seam allowance. So this is the cut size, and what I've trimmed out is simply the finished size in the center, because that's what you're going to see in your block. And I can take these and put them on a piece of fabric and start to slide them around and see, what am I getting? Am I ever looking down here and seeing just one color? Am I looking here and seeing, a different color? All of a sudden I have one that's red and one that's purple, because that will happen then when you cut it up. So same thing here. I can slide that around And you see, no matter where that's landing on the fabric, I have fairly consistent colors showing. Same thing here. I can slide this around as well, and I'm for the most part still always seeing that purple. There's a few areas here where I'm not seeing a lot of the purple, but it gives you a way to simulate what that fabric is going to look like cut up in a quilt block. You know, and here's my one that I said would not cut up well. See, now we've got solid yellow and solid purple, you know, so two very different colors when I move my sheet back on this fabric. So it's a great way for you to kind of simulate what it's going to look like cut up in a quilt and decide if you think it will cut up well. So that's one thing to keep in mind is, you know, do you have that color consistency for it to work? The other thing to keep in mind when you start to put large scale prints into the center of your quilt, in the border, they kind of are their own thing. They're independent, they're out there. But when you start to put large scale prints into your quilt center, into your block area, the one thing to keep in mind is large scale prints kind of tend to steal the show. They tend to become the dominant print just because they are so colorful and so showy. And when you have a large scale print like this one, and you put it into a quilt block with some of the smaller scale prints like this, what you will find is they will become kind of dominant sometimes in the quilt. So keep that in mind. These two together, when you look at it, I would guess most people's eye is going to be drawn to this fabric, not this fabric. Here is the same fabric, but in a lot hotter and brighter and bolder colorway, which can sometimes compete a little better with those large scale prints. If you go to something that's brighter, darker, more saturated than them, they sometimes have a little more ability to hold their own and not be dominated by that large scale print. So it all depends on the look that you're going for, but do keep in mind if they're in the mix, they sometimes become the star of the show, whether you intended them to be or not. The last thing to keep in mind when you are working with large scale prints is you do have to be a little more cautious about the other fabrics that you're putting in your quilt. So when you are putting other fabrics in your quilt and you have a large scale print like this, they tend to also be more multicolor prints. So you have to be a little more conscious about what you're putting next to them to make sure that you have good contrast with the accompanying pieces if you are cutting this up and putting this into a block in your quilt center, and making sure that what you're putting next to these fabrics will have contrast with all of the colors in the print, at least to some degree, versus being able to look at it and say, oh, well, that's a blue fabric, I'm going to put a purple next to it, that'll be fine. Here you have a purple fabric, but a lot of other colors in the mix that you need to be considering and taking a look at when you're putting your color palette together. You know, if you're using a print like this in a border, lots of times what we'll do is we'll pop an inner border in, and the inner border kind of separates it from the quilt center, and it's easy to find one color that you can use in your inner border that will contrast with everything in the outer border. So for this one, I might do a light teal blue or a light purple, and that would easily give me a contrast piece with this. But if I'm putting this into my center of my quilt, into my blocks, it tends to come in contact with a lot of other fabrics, not just one fabric. Like I said, if you're using it as a border, it's touching the inner border and the binding, and that's it. But as soon as it's going into the quilt in blocks, it's going to, generally speaking, come in contact with a lot more fabrics. So you have to be a little more conscious of what you're pairing it up with to make sure that you're pairing it with things that have contrast, not just with that dark purple background, but some degree of contrast with all of the colors in the fabric. So those are some tips and tricks for working with large prints. They're fun to incorporate into your quilts, especially if you have some bigger blocks in your quilts. It's definitely fun to work some of those larger scale prints in, but just, you know, be cognizant of how they work and how they tend to play in the mix, and don't be afraid to use them, but definitely be conscious of how they're going to behave and what they're going to be interacting with within your quilt design. So thank you guys for joining us today.